2:47 a.m. The ER doors exploded inward. A Navy SEAL commander lay dying, blood pressure crashing, shrapnel buried deep in his side. But when they typed his blood, the screen flashed blank. Unknown variant. No match in any military or civilian database on Earth. As surgeons watched him fade, the blonde rookie nurse stepped forward, rolling up her sleeve. "I'm a match," she said, "a blood type shared by fewer than 200 people worldwide." But when the commander woke up, he didn't thank her. He recognized her from a classified medical program that officially never existed. This isn't fiction. The commander was 40 minutes from death when arterial bleeds overwhelmed the trauma bay. Military databases across 3 continents returned 0 matches for his blood variant. Then the blonde rookie nurse, 3 weeks into her ER rotation, offered her veins. The statistical probability of their genetic overlap, 1 in 3 billion, impossible. Unless they were never strangers to begin with. And unless someone at the Pentagon already knew exactly why their blood sang the same forbidden song. The anesthesiologist hesitated, tubing in hand, staring at the compatibility screen that still screamed, "Oh no," but the commander's heart rate was free-falling, 40 beats per minute, then 35, blood pressure so low the monitor flashed critical amber. The blonde nurse, her badge read Sarah, 26 years old, fresh from Johns Hopkins, had already prepped her own arm with antiseptic, the iodine staining her skin copper orange in the surgical lights. "Transfuse now or he codes," she said, her voice carrying none of the tremor that should have belonged to a rookie. The chief of surgery made the snap decision, breaking protocol that had stood for 70 years. Sarah's blood flowed into David Vance's veins at 2:14 a.m., and immediately, impossibly, his vitals stabilized, the bleeding slowed, the monitors quieted. It was as if his body had been waiting for exactly this specific molecular signature, an identical antigen pattern so rare that hematology textbooks dismissed it as theoretical. 8 years earlier, both had been selected for Project Aegir, a Defense Advanced Research Projects initiative so classified that the Secretary of Defense himself required retina scan clearance to view the files. The program sought to create universal soldiers, operatives whose blood could be transfused between any human without rejection, whose tissue regenerated at accelerated rates, whose very genetic code had been optimized for battlefield survival. They were 30 subjects in the first cohort. Scientists called them the chimeras. By the end of the first year, 28 were dead from cytokine storms or organ liquefaction. The program was terminated, records shredded, participants officially listed as killed in training accidents, but 2 had survived the genetic modification. 2 had been smuggled out by a whistleblower surgeon who couldn't stomach the euthanasia protocols. David Vance had his memories wiped chemically and was reassigned to SEAL Team 6, his new identity layered over the old like scar tissue. Sarah, then Subject 7, had been given a new Social Security number, a nursing degree paid for by black budget shell companies, and a promise that if she ever revealed her blood type to any medical database, extraction teams would arrive within the hour. She had kept her silence for 8 years, working night shifts, drawing her own blood in secret when she needed transfusions after a car accident 3 years prior, paying cash to offshore labs to ensure her Rh0 variant never touched American health records, until tonight. Until she watched the commander brought in, his dog tags catching the fluorescent light, and recognized the scar behind his ear, the telltale mark of the Aegir implant port. She had rolled up her sleeve knowing exactly what would happen, knowing that saving him meant exposing herself. The surgery lasted 4 hours. By dawn, Vance was in the ICU, ventilator tube removed, consciousness returning in waves of morphine and trauma. Sarah stood in the hallway, scrubbing her hands for the 3rd time, watching him through the glass. She should have left. Should have walked out the staff entrance and disappeared into the city before the blood work reached the Pentagon's automated surveillance systems. But she stayed. Because she remembered him from the holding cells 8 years ago, the only other subject who hadn't screamed when they injected the synthetic hemoglobin, the only one who had looked at her with recognition instead of madness. At 6:17 a.m., Vance's eyes opened fully. He didn't look at the ceiling. He didn't look at the heart monitor. He looked straight through the ICU glass and found her eyes. His lips moved. No sound came out. But Sarah read them anyway. Subject 7. His voice was a rasp when he finally spoke aloud, the words carrying across the silent room to where 2 men in charcoal suits had just stepped off the elevator. Men whose badges didn't identify any agency, whose shoes were military issue despite the civilian cut of their jackets. They're here, Vance whispered, his hand trembling as he pointed toward the hallway. They know you broke protocol. Run. Sarah didn't run. She stood frozen in the hallway, her scrub top still damp with the commander's blood, watching the two men in charcoal suits move with the fluid coordination of operators who had performed hospital extractions before. The taller one reached inside his jacket, not for a weapon, but for a tablet, its screen glowing with biometric data that shouldn't have existed. Sarah Chen, Subject 7. Terminal response authorized. The words were visible from 20 feet away, inverted in the glass reflection of the ICU door. Vance ripped the IV from his arm. Blood arced across the white sheets as he rolled off the gurney, collapsed to his knees, then forced himself upright using the bed rail. His surgical stitches screamed against the movement, fresh red blooming through his hospital gown, but he positioned himself between Sarah and the agents, blocking their line of sight with his trembling body. "You don't remember," he gasped, his face gray with pain. "But I do. The memory wipe didn't take. Not completely. I know where the others are buried." The shorter agent stepped forward, palms open in a gesture that might have been placating if not for the deadness in his eyes. "Commander Vance, you're experiencing post-operative delirium. The woman behind you is not who you think she is. She's a security liability with classified biological modifications." He paused, letting the words land. "Just like you. But unlike you, she never completed the behavioral conditioning. She's unstable." Sarah's back pressed against the nursing station counter, her hand finding the cold metal of the crash cart behind her. The revelation struck her like physical force, not the accusation of instability, but the confirmation that Vance had undergone conditioning while she had not. That's why they wanted her dead and him contained. She had escaped before they could install the obedience protocols. The agents weren't here to kill them both. They were here to retrieve Vance and terminate her before she could contaminate his programming with her independent blood. "You see it now," Vance whispered, not looking back at her. "The difference. When they transfused me with your blood in that operating room, I felt it. The conditioning started to break. Your cells are wild, unprogrammed." He turned his head slightly, and Sarah saw his eyes clearly for the first time, one brown, one hazel, heterochromia that hadn't been there 8 years ago. They had changed him more than they'd changed her. The pivot recontextualized everything. They weren't two equals who had survived. He was a weapon being recalled, and she was the virus infecting his system. The taller agent lost patience. He drew a device from his belt that looked like a modified taser, ceramic and white, with a biometric reader where the trigger should have been. "Deactivation wand," he announced calmly. "One touch to Subject 7's carotid artery induces immediate autonomic collapse. No toxins, no trace. Just a nurse who died of sudden cardiac arrest after an all-night surgery." He looked at Vance. "Step aside, Commander. You're government property. She's just a defective unit." Vance moved with the speed that had made him a SEAL, despite the gaping wound in his side. He grabbed the agent's wrist, twisted it sharply, and slammed the man's head into the wall-mounted defibrillator case. Glass shattered. The wand clattered to the floor. But Vance's knees buckled, his fresh stitches torn, blood spreading rapidly across his gown. Sarah moved without thinking, catching him under the arm, her shoulder taking his weight. He was lighter than he should have been, his body density altered by the genetic modifications, hollow-boned like a bird, designed for endurance and rapid healing that hadn't quite worked as planned. The second agent reached for his radio, but before he could speak, the ICU monitors behind them erupted in a cacophony of alarms. Not Vance's vitals, he had disconnected himself, but every other patient in the unit. Simultaneous cardiac events. The agent froze, checking his tablet. "Electromagnetic pulse," he muttered. "Localized, someone's jamming the biometrics." Sarah felt it then, a vibration in her teeth, a resonance in her blood. It was coming from her, from them. The synchronized blood was generating a field. She dragged Vance toward the service stairs, leaving a trail of his blood that seemed too bright, almost luminescent under the fluorescent lights, forming a glowing path that the agents could follow. He leaned heavily against her, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "They put trackers in us," he said. "Not GPS, biological. The blood you gave me, it synchronized us. Made us visible as a single signal. They can track us now as one bright beacon instead of two dim ones. That's why he didn't use the wand on me. They need me functional. You're the only one they want, dead. They stumbled through the stairwell door and down 3 flights of concrete steps, Sarah's nursing clogs slipping on the misted floors, the sound of their pursuers echoing from above and below. The hospital had become a trap, the walls closing in. Behind them, tactical boots descended from the roof access, heavy and numerous. The stairwell smelled of disinfectant and ozone, and Sarah realized her hands were glowing faintly under the emergency lighting, her veins visible through her skin, pulsing with the same iridescent quality as Vance's blood. The transfusion was rewriting her physiology in real time, activating dormant modifications she hadn't known she carried. They burst through the fire door into the underground parking garage, morning light stabbing through the concrete slats in dusty pillars. Sarah's silver Honda sat 30 feet away, but between them idled a black Suburban with government plates, dark-tinted windows, and an antenna array that screamed military intelligence. The engine was running, the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out, 60-ish silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a white lab coat over Kevlar tactical gear. Dr. Elena Voss, the whistleblower surgeon who had smuggled Sarah out of the facility 8 years ago, who had supposedly died in a car accident 3 years later. "Get in the back," Voss commanded, her voice carrying the snap of someone used to being obeyed in crisis. Now, before the thermal scans go live. Sarah hesitated, looking back at the stairwell door, where the sound of pursuit grew louder, the heavy boots multiplying. Vance was barely conscious, his head lolling against her shoulder, his blood soaking through her scrubs. "If they catch us," Sarah started. "They won't kill you," Voss interrupted, opening the rear door and helping Sarah load Vance onto the leather seat. "They'll activate you, both of you. The Chimera protocol isn't just genetic modification, it's behavioral firmware. You, Subject 7, you escaped before the final implant. But Vance, he has the kill switch already installed. They just haven't triggered it because he was useful. But now that he's contaminated with your blood, he's a rogue element. They'll purge him unless we get to Baltimore in the next 4 hours." Sarah climbed in beside Vance, pressing her hands against his wound to staunch the bleeding that seemed to flow in rhythm with her own heartbeat. The Suburban's engine roared, tires squealing as Voss accelerated up the parking ramp, crashing through the wooden barrier arm without slowing. In the side mirror, Sarah saw men in charcoal suits pouring out of the hospital entrance, raising rifles that weren't standard military issue, sleek and ceramic, designed to fire darts, not bullets. One agent took aim, but the Suburban was already merging into morning traffic, invisible in the stream of commuters. "What happens in Baltimore?" Sarah asked, shouting over the engine noise. Voss tossed a file into the back seat. It landed in Sarah's lap, manila folder stamped with a red phoenix symbol she remembered from the holding cells. "The 28 other subjects," Voss said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "You thought they died in 2015. They didn't. They went into cryogenic suspension, but last week someone started thawing them out. Systematic activation. All 28 are now awake, conditioned and under direct Pentagon control. Someone is building an army of the original Chimeras, and you're the only two who aren't under their command. That's why they need you dead, Sarah. You and Vance carry the original genetic sequence, the master key, the kill switch codes that can stop the others." Sarah opened the file with trembling hands. Inside were satellite photographs of a warehouse in the Baltimore harbor. Thermal imaging showed 30 heat signatures arranged in neat rows. But it was the final photograph that stopped her breath. A close-up through a warehouse window showing rows of gurneys. On the nearest one, connected to IV drips, lay a young man with Vance's face, and on the next, a woman with hers. Identical, cloned, enhanced. The realization crashed over her they weren't the last survivors. They were the obsolete prototypes. "We're not the originals," Vance whispered, his eyes fluttering open to see the photograph, his voice barely audible over the road noise. "We're the failed beta tests." And that's when the Suburban's windshield shattered, a ceramic dart embedding itself in the headrest inches from Voss's skull. The caravan of pursuit visible in the rearview mirror, closer than they should have been, tracking the biological beacon that Sarah and Vance were now broadcasting to the world. Dr. Voss wrenched the wheel hard right, sending the Suburban careening across 3 lanes of traffic. The ceramic dart still vibrating in the headrest. A semi-truck horn blared as they missed its front bumper by inches, but the maneuver broke the pursuit vehicle's line of sight for 3 critical seconds. Sarah pressed her body over Vance. feeling his blood seep through her scrubs, warm and somehow electric against her skin. The synchronized blood was doing something else now. She could feel his heartbeat in her own chest, a phantom rhythm that wasn't hers. 62 beats per minute, irregular, failing. How many? Sarah shouted over the wind, screaming through the shattered windshield. 3 vehicles, Voss snapped, checking the rearview mirror. Black government plates, same model as ours. They're tracking your genetic signature, not GPS. Every minute you two stay in proximity, you shine brighter on their sensors. Vance groaned, his hand gripping Sarah's arm with surprising strength. The clones, he rasped. If we're the beta tests, what are they? Voss didn't answer immediately. She took an exit ramp at 70 miles per hour, tires protesting, and merged onto the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, heading toward the harbor. Finally, she spoke, her voice flat with the weight of 8 years of secrets. You weren't the first successful subjects. You were the first to survive the genetic modification without immediate rejection. But you were imperfect, unstable, emotional. The 28 in suspension were the refined product. Stronger, obedient, no free will, just programming. And someone has been activating them one by one over the past 72 hours. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. For what? That's the question, Voss said, her eyes meeting Sarah's in the rearview mirror. And it's worse than you think. The original Project Aegir wasn't about creating super soldiers for battlefield use. It was about creating a biological infrastructure, universal blood donors who could keep elite forces alive indefinitely. But the new iteration, the one activating now, is different. The clones aren't being prepared for combat, they're being prepared for harvesting. The word landed like a stone. Harvesting organ farming, Voss continued, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The Pentagon has a list of high-value officials, senators, defense contractors, people with terminal illnesses who need perfect match organs. The 28 clones are genetic blanks, designed to be compatible with any human recipient. They're waking them up to harvest their organs over the next 6 months. Hearts, livers, kidneys, bone marrow, and then they die. Disposable bodies for disposable parts, Sarah's mind reeled. The photograph in the file, the rows of gurneys, the IV drips, not an army, a slaughterhouse. But we complicate that, Vance said, his voice stronger now, anger cutting through the pain, because we have the original genetic sequence. The master key, Voss nodded. You two carry the epigenetic kill switch, a sequence in your blood that can trigger total systemic collapse in the clones. One transfusion from either of you into any of the 28, and their modified biology turns against them. They liquefy from the inside out within hours. That's why they want you dead before you reach Baltimore. If you get into that warehouse, if you contaminate their stock, they lose $1 billion inventory and years of black budget research. The Suburban's engine suddenly coughed, then roared back to life. Voss cursed, checking the dashboard. They're close enough to pulse the electronics. EMP burst, 5 more minutes, and they'll fry our ignition. Sarah looked down at her hands, still faintly luminescent, the veins glowing beneath her skin. If they were tracking the synchronized signal, what if we separate, she asked. Would that break the tracking? Yes, Voss said, but it would also kill Vance. He's lost too much blood. Without your proximity, without the shared cellular resonance keeping his modified physiology stable, he'll crash. The transfusion created a dependency. You're keeping him alive just by being near him now. The revelation struck Sarah like a physical blow. She wasn't just his only hope for survival in the future. She was his life support in the present. Every second she stayed, she saved him. Every second she stayed, she led the hunters closer to their prey. Vance reached up, his hand finding hers, his skin fever hot. Then don't separate, he said. Use it. Use the signal. What? If they can track us, we can lead them somewhere. A trap, or at least a choke point where we control the terrain. Voss was already shaking her head. There are 3 of them and 3 vehicles. They have ceramic weapons, tactical training, and authorization to terminate. You have a wounded SEAL, a nurse, and a doctor with a pistol I haven't fired in 8 years. Then we need an army, Sarah said quietly. She looked at the file still clutched in her lap, at the satellite photographs of the warehouse. 30 heat signatures, 28 clones, and 2 others, the original patterns that the clones were copied from. If Vance was right, if their blood could trigger collapse in the clones, could it also trigger awakening? Could it break the conditioning? The kill switch works both ways, Sarah said, the idea forming as she spoke. If our blood can destroy their modified biology, maybe it can also rewrite it. Free them. Voss's eyes widened in the rearview mirror. That's insane. You'd have to transfuse them while they're in cryosuspension. You'd have to flood their entire system with your blood before they fully wake. And even if it worked, you'd have 28 disoriented super soldiers with no loyalty to anyone. Better than 28 organ donors waiting for the knife. Vance growled, struggling to sit up, his face pale but his eyes clear. And better than letting them hunt us to the edge of the earth. We go into the warehouse, we don't hide from them. We let them chase us right through the front door. And then we turn their inventory against them. The Suburban suddenly swerved again, but this time it wasn't evasive driving. The vehicle behind them had made contact, tapping their rear bumper at 90 miles per hour, sending them into a fishtail. Voss fought the wheel, but the road was slick with morning rain and the Suburban began to spin. Sarah wrapped her arms around Vance as the world became a blur of gray sky and concrete barriers. They hit the median strip, went airborne for a sickening moment, and crashed down on the opposite side of the highway, facing backward, engine smoking. Through the shattered rear window, Sarah saw the 3 black vehicles screech to a halt. Doors opening, men in charcoal suits stepping out with ceramic rifles raised. But they weren't looking at the Suburban. They were looking past it, toward the Baltimore skyline, where a column of black smoke was rising from the harbor district, where the warehouse was supposed to be. Voss grabbed Sarah's arm, her fingernails digging in. Someone else activated them early, she whispered, her face ashen. The harvest has already begun, and whoever is taking those organs, they just set the warehouse on fire to cover the evidence. We're not the only ones trying to stop this, but we might be the only ones who can prove it happened. Through the smoke, through the ringing in her ears, Sarah saw the agents hesitate, their tactical formation breaking as they checked their radios, receiving orders that clearly contradicted their current mission. The chain of command was fracturing. Someone high up was covering their tracks, destroying the evidence, burning the clones rather than letting them be captured or freed. "We have to go," Vance said, pushing open his door, blood streaming from his reopened wound, but his legs holding him upright. Now. Before the fire destroys everything, before they erase what they built, he reached back for Sarah's hand. She took it, feeling the electric resonance between them surge, the synchronized blood responding to danger with a biological imperative older than thought. Run or fight, hide or reveal. They had been running for 8 years. Today they would fight. Sarah stepped out of the wreckage, glass crunching under her shoes, and looked toward the burning harbor. The smoke was thick and black, carrying the smell of burning plastic and something else, something chemical and wrong, the scent of engineered flesh returning to ash. 28 souls or 28 products, depending on who you asked. But they wouldn't die anonymous. Not if she had to walk into that furnace herself and pull the truth from the flames. "Lead them to us," she told Vance, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Let them see the signal. Let them chase us right into the fire, because that's where the proof is. That's where we end this." And as the agents resumed their advance, rifles raised, Sarah and Vance began to run, not away from the danger, but toward the smoke, toward the burning warehouse where the truth of Project Agar was being incinerated in real time, carrying between them the only weapon that could expose the conspiracy or destroy it forever. The blood that refused to be classified, the life that refused to be harvested, and the proof that some experiments were never meant to stay buried. The warehouse door hung off its hinges like a broken jaw, spilling black smoke into the morning air. Sarah and Vance stumbled through, the heat immediately blistering the exposed skin on their faces, the synchronized blood pulsing between them in a rhythm that matched the throbbing alarms inside the facility. The agents were 40 yards behind, weapons raised, but they hesitated at the threshold. The fire was too hot, the structural integrity too compromised, and their orders had shifted from capture to containment. They were sealing the perimeter now, calling in air support to ensure nothing walked out of the inferno alive. Inside, the warehouse was not a storage facility but a surgical theater on an industrial scale. Rows of glass containment units lined the walls, each one cracked by the heat, the fluid inside boiling and steaming. Within them floated bodies, 28 of them, or what remained. Some were already charred beyond recognition. The accelerated healing of the chimera genetics unable to outpace the flames. Others stirred weakly, eyes opening in the boiling tanks. mouths opening in silent screams as the conditioning fought against the pain. They weren't soldiers, they were inventory. Vance collapsed against a steel support beam, his hand pressed against the wound in his side, blood seeping between his fingers. "They're burning the evidence," he gasped. "Not just hiding it, erasing it." Sarah moved down the aisle, her scrub sticking to her skin, the luminescence in her veins now blazing bright enough to cast shadows. She reached the central terminal, a computer array that had survived the initial blaze, protected by fire suppression systems designed for electronics, not flesh. The screen flickered with data, recipient lists, surgery schedules, transport manifests, senators, defense contractors, a former president waiting for a heart that was growing in Tank 14. The conspiracy wasn't rogue operators, it was the infrastructure of power itself, using these bodies to extend the lives of the elite. Dr. Voss burst through a side entrance, her lab coat singed, her pistol drawn, face streaked with soot. She had fought her way past the perimeter, or the agents had let her through. Sarah couldn't tell which. "The kill switch," Voss shouted over the roar of the flames. "You have to choose now. Use it and they die clean. Don't use it and they burn conscious." Sarah looked at the tanks. In Tank 7, a woman opened her eyes, Sarah's eyes, same cheekbones, same hair. In Tank 12, a man with Vance's jawline, his fingers twitching against the glass. They weren't generic clones, they were specific duplicates. 14 copies of Sarah, 14 of Vance. The organ harvesting wasn't random compatibility. It was perfect genetic replication, ensuring zero rejection for the recipients. The rich weren't just buying organs, they were buying immortality through replication. Vance dragged himself to her side, his hand finding hers. Their blood met again, mingling in the palm of her hand, and the luminescence flared. The clones in the tanks reacted. Their eyes focused. The ones strong enough to move pressed their hands against the glass, reaching toward the light, toward the source code of their existence. Not a kill switch, Sarah realized, an awakening. She slammed her bloody palm against the terminal's biometric scanner. The system screamed with alarms, red lights flooding the facility as the network recognized the master genetic sequence. But instead of terminating the subjects, Sarah poured her blood into the nutrient delivery system, a desperate gamble that the shared fluid pathway would carry her epigenetic markers to all 28 tanks simultaneously. The glass shattered, not from the heat, but from within. The clones burst outward, gasping, falling to the concrete floors, their bodies steaming in the cool air, but they didn't attack, they didn't flee. They looked at Sarah and Vance with recognition, complete human recognition. The blood had worked. It had overwritten the obedience programming, replacing the command structure with autonomy, with identity. They weren't weapons anymore. They were witnesses. The warehouse roof groaned, a massive steel truss beginning to buckle. Vance pulled Sarah back as the agents outside opened fire, ceramic rounds punching through the metal walls, designed to dissolve in the body without trace, but now simply tearing through the burning infrastructure. The clones moved with impossible speed, the chimera genetics fully activated, dragging the wounded and the weak toward the loading docks, toward the harbor water that could extinguish the flames consuming their skin. Dr. Voss led the exodus, her medical training overriding her fear, directing the duplicates through a breach in the western wall where the fire had weakened the structure. Sarah and Vance followed last, carrying a clone each, Sarah carrying a girl who looked like her at 16, Vance carrying a man with his face but younger, unlined by war. They broke into the daylight as the warehouse collapsed behind them, a roar of flame and twisted metal that sent a pillar of black smoke 3,000 feet into the air, visible from downtown Baltimore, visible from the Pentagon itself. The agents scattered, their mission compromised, their authorization useless in the face of 30 survivors who now shared the same face, the same rare blood type, the same impossible testimony. In the aftermath, the congressional investigation took 18 months. The recipients on the list denied everything, claimed the data was fabricated, but the clones provided DNA evidence that couldn't be denied. Genetic material that matched the president's would-be heart donor, that matched the senator's would-be liver donor. Project Aegir was exposed, not as a conspiracy theory, but as a procurement system for the wealthy, using the bodies of modified humans as spare parts. But the final surprise came 3 weeks later, in a secure hospital room where Sarah and Vance were being debriefed. A blood test, routine, checking for contaminants from the fire. The results came back with a pattern that made the doctors call in specialists. Sarah's blood was no longer just Rh null. It had stabilized into something new, a universal recipient and donor simultaneously, carrying the genetic markers of both her original DNA and Vance's, permanently merged by the synchronization. And deeper in the scan, hidden in the genetic noise, was a third pattern, a new combination, a child. The transfusion hadn't just saved Vance's life or freed the clones. It had created a new lineage, a genetic legacy that would pass the chimera traits to the next generation, making the modifications heritable, uncontainable, and impossible to ever fully erase. The project wasn't over. It had just evolved into a family. As the congressional hearings began and the smoke cleared over Baltimore Harbor, Sarah looked at Vance, at the duplicates who had become their siblings, at the life growing inside her that carried the blood of two subjects who were never supposed to meet, and she understood that some experiments don't end when the lab burns. Some just begin to breathe on their own. The 28 survivors scattered across the country, each given new identities by witness protection programs that didn't understand what they were protecting. They carried the same rare blood type, the same enhanced healing, the same biological markers that had made them valuable as inventory. Some became nurses, others became soldiers, one ran for local office. They shared no conscious memories of the glass tanks, but they shared the phantom sensation of floating, of waiting, of being prepared for harvest, and they shared something the Pentagon could never extract, the genetic potential to pass the chimera traits to their own children, a lineage of universal donors, an enhanced physiology that could never be recalled, never be contained, never be returned to the classified files from which it had escaped. Sarah and Vance disappeared from the medical databases again, but this time by choice, not by erasure. They live now in the northern Cascades, where the hospitals are small and the winters isolate them from the systems that once tracked them. The child was born 7 months later, a girl with mismatched eyes and a blood type that returns error on every military scanner. She is the first naturally conceived chimera, the proof that the experiment had transcended its creators, evolving from a defense initiative into a human family tree. The congressional investigation closed after 18 months, citing national security. The recipients on the donor lists retired comfortably. The clones who testified were declared mentally unfit. But somewhere in a classified vault, there is a file marked extinct that contains 2 names and a genetic sequence that is now walking, talking, and reproducing outside any laboratory, carrying in its cells the only weapon that could stop future projects like Aegir, the truth that some blood cannot be typed, some lives cannot be harvested, and some experiments refuse to die when the lights go out. We tell these stories not because they end with justice, but because they remind us that the human body is not a spare parts warehouse, and that the code in our veins belongs to us alone. If this reached you, if you believe some truths deserve to survive the fire, subscribe, stay for what they don't want found.